Colleen stared at the flickering video on the archive monitor, her stomach churning as she clutched the locket she dug from under the floorboards. On the screen, the grainy footage of a massive mining explosion lit up the dark. But it wasn't the fire that broke her. It was the realization that her own college degree was paid for by the blood money meant to bury her brother's body. Just as the truth clicked into place, the heavy steel door of the records room slammed shut, and the click of a sheriff's revolver echoed through the cramped, suffocating stacks of paper. As the barrel pressed against the base of her skull, Colleen didn't beg for her life. She simply looked at her reflection in the dark glass, seeing not a hero, but a beneficiary of the very crime she was trying to solve. "Is this what Jacob heard?" she whispered, her voice trembling as the sheriff leaned in close. He didn't answer with words, only the cold, metallic slide of the safety turning off. Outside, the bulldozers were already idling on her family's land, ready to bury the evidence under tons of rock forever. And Colleen realized that in this town, the only thing more dangerous than a lie is the person who finally discovers they've been living on the profits of it. The bell had rung 20 minutes ago, but Silas still crouched in the corner, fingers digging into the peeling linoleum like he could claw his way through the floor. His breath came in ragged bursts, each one laced with the sour tang of old sweat and something sharper. Metal, maybe, or the coppery sting of blood. Colleen's knuckles throbbed where his teeth had grazed them, the skin already puffing into a bruise. She pressed her palm against the wall, the plaster cool and gritty under her fingers, and forced herself to exhale. The classroom smelled of stale chalk and the faint, sickly sweetness of the air freshener someone had sprayed too liberally after lunch. It did nothing to mask the stench of desperation. "Silas," she said, keeping her voice low. "Steady. You're going to break your hand if you keep that up." He didn't look at her. His shoulders hitched once, twice, like he was fighting something inside his own ribs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering in a slow, uneven rhythm that made her temples ache. She could hear the distant shouts of kids in the hallway, the slam of lockers, the muffled laughter that sounded too bright, too carefree for this place. None of it reached Silas. He was a storm contained in a too small body, and she was the only thing standing between him and the door. Colleen crouched, slow, deliberate. The floor creaked under her weight. "You want to talk about it?" His head snapped up. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites streaked with red. "Talk about what?" he spat. "How my old man's gonna lose the trailer if I don't bring home another check by Friday? How my little sister's been coughing up green shit for a week and Ma can't afford the clinic." His laugh was a broken thing. "You want to fix that, Miss Hargrove? You got a magic wand in that purse of yours?" She didn't. She had a half-eaten granola bar, a stack of ungraded essays, and the gnawing certainty that no matter how many times she stepped between Silas and the world would always find a way to push back harder. The bruise on her wrist pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Outside, the wind rattled the loose pane in the window, a sound like bones knocking together. Silas lunged suddenly, not for the door, but for the desk beside him. His hand swept a stack of textbooks onto the floor with a crash that echoed like a gunshot in the empty room. Colleen didn't flinch, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She moved into his space, her hands raised, palms open. "Silas, stop. Look at me." He swung around, his face contorted. He was 17, but in this light, with the shadows of the dying town stretching through the window, he looked ancient. He threw a punch, not a calculated strike, but a wild, flailing burst of agony. Colleen caught his wrist, the bone feeling fragile beneath his skin, and used his momentum to guide him toward the wall. They hit the lockers in the hallway with a hollow boom, She pinned his arms, her chest heaving against his. I can't breathe," he wheezed, but he stopped fighting. The fight drained out of him all at once, leaving him limp in her grip. Colleen held him there for a long moment, the cold metal of the lockers biting into her back, until his tremors subsided into a dull, rhythmic shaking. This was the pervasive instability of West Virginia, a place where the youth didn't just grow up, they eroded. When she finally let him go, Silas slumped against the wall, sliding down until his knees hit the floor. He didn't look up as she walked back into the classroom to gather her things. Her hands were shaking as she shoved the ungraded essays into her bag. The silence of the school was a heavy, physical weight, a tomb for the dreams that had died here decades ago. She drove home through a rain that felt more like a gray shroud than water. The town of Blackthorn was a skeletal remnant, buildings peeling like sunburnt skin under a perpetual Appalachian gloom. Every turn of the wheel felt like a descent. She pulled into the gravel driveway of her childhood home, a white clapboard house that seemed to be shrinking into the earth. Her mother, Eleanor, had been gone for 6 months, but the house still breathed with her presence, mostly in the form of the mountain of things she had left behind. The attic was the worst of it. Colleen climbed the narrow, groaning stairs, the air growing thicker with every step. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of her flashlight like tiny, frantic ghosts. Her mother hadn't just been a hoarder of objects. She had been a hoarder of time. Boxes were stacked to the slanted ceiling, filled with yellowed newspapers, chipped china, and clothes that still smelled of lavender and mothballs. Colleen began the grueling labor of sorting, her muscles aching as she hauled heavy trunks across the warped floorboards. Each item was a trigger. A cracked teacup reminded her of the quiet, desperate tea parties Eleanor held when the money ran low. A stack of old catalogs spoke of the things they could never afford. The physical labor was a distraction from the emotional weight, but it was a losing battle. She felt the house pressing in on her, a prison of memory that she had tried to escape for 20 years, only to be dragged back by the gravity of grief. She reached for a small, wooden sewing kit tucked into the corner of a cedar chest. It was a modest thing, the varnish worn thin by decades of Eleanor's restless hands. When Colleen opened it, expecting to find spools of thread and rusted needles, she found a false bottom. Her fingers brushed against a cold, plastic edge. She pried it up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a single, dust-covered cassette tape. The label was handwritten in Eleanor's cramped, elegant script. July 1994. Colleen's breath hitched. July 1994 was the month Jacob disappeared, the month the world stopped turning for the Hargrove family. She turned the tape over in her hands, the plastic feeling brittle. This wasn't a random relic. It had been buried, preserved like a secret that refused to stay dead. The investigation she hadn't known she was starting began in that moment. The mundane task of cleaning replaced by a sudden, sharp hunger for the truth. She carried the tape downstairs to the living room, where an old boombox sat on the sideboard, a relic of her teenage years. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the tape into the slot. The machine whirred, a mechanical groan that seemed to protest the awakening of the past. Static filled the room first, a white noise that sounded like falling rain. And then, a voice. "They said it was an accident," Eleanor whispered. Her voice was frantic, thin, laced with a terror Colleen had never heard in life. "But I saw the way they looked at him, like he was already dead. He didn't run, Thomas. He didn't run. They took him. They took my boy because he knew." Colleen sank onto the floor, the cold linoleum biting through her jeans. The revelation shattered 30 years of carefully constructed lies. Jacob hadn't run away to the city. He hadn't abandoned them. The official story, the one that had turned her father into a ghost and her mother into a recluse, was a fiction. Her brother had been taken. The tape ended with a sharp click, leaving the house in a silence so profound it felt like the walls were holding their breath. Colleen stared at the boombox, her mind racing. If Jacob hadn't run, where was he? And who were they? The next morning, the school felt different. The flickering fluorescent lights seemed like eyes watching her every move. She found Miller, the janitor, in his small, ammonia-scented closet in the basement. He was a big man, stooped by decades of hauling trash, his face a roadmap of lines that all seemed to lead to the same place. Exhaustion. "Miller," she said, stepping into the cramped space. "I found something. A tape my mother left." Miller didn't look up from the mop bucket he was filling. The sound of the water was loud, echoing off the cinder block walls. "Some things are better left in the dark, Colleen. Your mother. She was a woman who saw ghosts where there were only shadows." She wasn't lying, Miller. She said Jacob didn't run. She said the accident wasn't what they told us. You were there that night. You and my dad. Miller finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of mud, and for a second, Colleen saw a flash of pure, unadulterated fear. His hands, gnarled and stained with age, began to tremble. He gripped the handle of the mop so hard his knuckles turned white. "Listen to me," he hissed, his voice a gravelly growl. "You're a smart girl. You got out once. You should have stayed out. This town, it doesn't forgive people who dig up the floorboards. You stop this. You stop it now if you want to keep breathing this mountain air." He pushed past her, the smell of bleach and old sweat trailing in his wake. The warning wasn't just a suggestion. It was a threat. It confirmed everything. The silence of Blackthorn wasn't a symptom of decay. It was a weapon. Colleen didn't go back to her classroom. She drove out of the school parking lot, the tires of her old sedan crunching on the gravel, and headed toward the outskirts of town. The Hargrove family barn sat on a ridge overlooking the valley. A gray, hulking structure that looked like it might collapse if the wind blew too hard. It had been years since anyone had stepped inside. The air inside the barn was cold and smelled of damp hay and rusted metal. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the roof, casting long skeletal bars across the floor. Colleen moved cautiously, her boots kicking up clouds of dust. She was looking for anything, a mark on the wood, a hidden corner, a sign that her brother had been here before he vanished. She was near the back of the structure, near the old horse stalls, when the heavy barn doors groaned on their hinges. Two men stepped into the light. They weren't from town, at least not the parts Colleen frequented. They wore heavy work jackets and caps pulled low, their faces obscured by the shadows. "You're trespassing, Miss Hargrove," one of them said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "This property is under transition. You shouldn't be here." "This is my family's land," Colleen said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have every right." "Family don't mean much when the deeds are changing hands," the second man said. He stepped forward, his hand resting on a heavy metal pipe hanging from his belt. "We were told to keep the site clear. Now, you can walk out, or we can carry you." They were hired muscle. Her own extended family, Aunt Martha most likely, had put a watch on the place. The realization that her own blood was monitoring her movements sent a chill down her spine. She wasn't just fighting the town. She was fighting her own history. The first man lunged. He was fast, but Colleen was fueled by a decade of repressed rage. She swung her heavy industrial flashlight, the metal casing connecting with his ribs with a sickening thud. He gasped, doubling over, and she didn't wait. She kicked his knee, hearing the joint pop, and scrambled toward the workbench. The second man was on her before she could find a better weapon. He grabbed her hair, jerking her head back, and threw her against the rough timber of the wall. Stars exploded in her vision. She felt the coppery sting of blood in her mouth. As he raised the pipe, Colleen dived between his legs, grabbing a rusted crowbar from the floor. She swung upward, catching him in the shin. He roared in pain, stumbling back. She didn't stay to finish it. She scrambled toward the back of the barn, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. She reached a section of the floorboards that felt loose, a spot Jacob used to hide his cigarettes when they were kids. With a desperate grunt, she wedged the crowbar into the gap and pried. The wood groaned and splintered. Tucked into the joists, wrapped in a piece of rotting flannel, was a small, silver object. She snatched it up just as the men regained their footing. "Hey!" the first one yelled, limping toward her. Colleen bolted through the side door, sprinting through the overgrown weeds toward her car. She fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life just as a heavy fist slammed against her window. She floored it, the tires spinning in the mud before catching. As she sped away, she looked down at the object in her hand. It was Jacob's silver locket, the one with the broken chain, the one the police said he'd taken with him when he ran. He hadn't taken it. It had been hidden, a silent witness to whatever had happened in that barn. Colleen pulled over a mile down the road, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the steering wheel. She opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, faded photo of their mother and a scrap of paper with a single word scrawled in Jacob's messy hand. Run. She wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a threat. And as she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw a dark SUV pull out from a side road, trailing her at a distance that was anything but accidental. Miller watched from the edge of the woods, his figure nearly invisible against the gray bark of the oaks. He saw the SUV follow her, saw the way Colleen's car fishtailed as she sped toward the town. A secret terror gnawed at his gut, a cold, heavy thing he'd been carrying for 30 years. He'd helped them. He'd been the one to scrub the blood off the concrete, the one to tell Eleanor that her boy was just a wild streak who'd finally snapped. He'd taken the money. It had paid for his wife's surgery, for the roof over his head, for the whiskey that kept the screams at bay. But as he watched Colleen disappear into the mist, he knew the debt was coming due. The silence was breaking, and in a town like Blackthorn, when the silence broke, it usually took everything with it. Colleen drove straight to the town square. She needed to see the one person who held the strings of the Hargrove legacy. Aunt Martha was there, standing by a rusted metal drum, the smoke from a small fire curling into the damp air. She was a woman of iron and pearls, her silver hair perfectly coiffed even in the rain. Beside her lay a stack of old photo albums, the history of the Hargroves, bound in leather and fading ink. "Aunt Martha?" Colleen said, stepping out of the car. Her voice was ice. "What are you doing?" Martha didn't look up. She tossed a handful of photos into the fire. The flames flared orange and blue as the chemicals in the old paper ignited. "Cleansing, Colleen. This family has been weighed down by the past for too long. It's time to let go of the things that don't serve us." "You're burning Jacob," Colleen said, walking toward the drum. "You're trying to erase him." Martha finally turned. Her eyes were flat, like polished stones. "Jacob erased himself the night he decided he was bigger than this town. This curiosity of yours, it's a sickness. It'll destroy what's left of our name. You think people will thank you for digging up the rot? They won't. They'll hate you for reminding them of what they've lost. I don't care about the name, Martha. I care about the truth. The truth is a luxury we can't afford. Martha hissed, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the wind. Go home, Colleen. Stop this before you find something you can't live with. Colleen turned and walked away. But she didn't go home. She went to the sheriff's office. It was a squat brick building that smelled of stale coffee and old cigarettes. Sheriff Daniel Carter sat behind a desk, piled high with paperwork, his badge gleaming under the flickering fluorescent lights. He was Martha's cousin, a man who had grown up in the shadow of the Hargrove name. I was attacked at the barn, Daniel, Colleen said, leaning over his desk. 2 men. They tried to kill me. Carter didn't move. He didn't even pick up a pen. The barn is private property, Colleen. You were trespassing. My men reported a woman acting erratically, swinging a flashlight at contractors. Sounds to me like you're the one who started the trouble. Contractors? They were thugs, and they were looking for this. She held up the locket. Carter's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened around his coffee mug. That's a piece of junk. You're seeing conspiracies in every shadow. Walk away, Colleen, for your own sake. As she left the office, she saw Carter pick up the phone. In her side mirror, she saw his cruiser pull out behind her. He wasn't protecting her. He was tailing her. The law in Blackthorn was just another layer of the burial. She reached her apartment and found the door slightly ajar. Her heart hammered. She pushed it open, her hand gripping the heavy flashlight in her bag. The room was untouched, except for the kitchen table. Sitting precisely in the center of the wood was a dead bird. A crow, its neck snapped, its glassy eyes staring at the ceiling. An Appalachian omen. A death warrant. Colleen didn't scream. She sat down at the table, the smell of the bird, a faint, metallic tang, filling her nostrils. She took out the cassette tape and the old school stereo she'd salvaged from the attic. She needed to hear it again. Not the words, but the space between them. She put on the headphones, turning the volume up until the static was a roar. She listened to Eleanor's confession over and over, until the words became meaningless sounds. And then she heard it. Behind her mother's voice, there was a rhythmic, mechanical thrum. It wasn't the wind. It was a roar, a deep, subterranean vibration that made the recording shake. It was the sound of a mining explosion. Colleen's breath hitched. There had been an explosion in 1994 at the Northridge site. The company had called it a natural methane pocket, a freak accident that had killed 3 men. Jacob hadn't been on the list of the dead. But if he'd been there, if he'd seen what caused it, she knew where she had to go. Her father, Thomas Hargrove, lived in a remote cabin across the county line. He'd left the house the day after the funeral for an empty casket, and hadn't looked back. The drive was 2 hours through winding mountain roads that felt like they were trying to shake her off. The cabin was a fortress of jagged scrap metal and debris, a perimeter of rust designed to keep the world at bay. Thomas was sitting on the porch, a shotgun resting across his knees, a bottle of cheap whiskey at his feet. "Get off my land," he roared as she stepped out of the car. He raised the gun, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "Dad, it's me. It's Colleen. I don't have a daughter. I don't have nothing but this bottle and this dirt. Leave." He leveled the shotgun. Colleen didn't move. "I found the tape, Dad. I heard Mom. I know about the explosion." Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. The gun wavered. "You don't know nothing. You're a child playing in the graveyard." He lunged at her, trying to push her back toward the car with the barrel of the gun. Colleen grabbed the steel, twisting it away from her body. They struggled in the mud, the physical desperation of 30 years of silence exploding into violence. She was younger, stronger, and driven by a clarity he'd long since drowned in alcohol. She pinned him against the rough logs of the cabin, her forearm against his throat. "Tell me," she screamed. "Tell me what you did." Thomas's face crumpled. The rage vanished, replaced by a hollow, soul-deep grief. He slumped against her, the shotgun falling into the dirt. "It wasn't an accident, Colleen. The company, they bypassed the sensors. They knew the pocket was there. They sent them in anyway." "And Jacob?" He went to warn them. He saw the shift lead override the alarms. He was there when it blew. Thomas began to sob, a harsh, dry sound. "They didn't want a witness. They offered us the land. They offered us the house. Martha. She said it was the only way to save what was left of us. We took the money, Colleen. We sold him for a piece of dirt." Colleen let go of him, her stomach churning. Every meal she'd eaten, every book she'd read, her entire education, it had all been paid for with her brother's blood. She wasn't just a victim. She was a beneficiary of the crime. "Where is he, Dad?" Thomas looked up, his eyes vacant. "He's still there, under the ridge. They sealed the shaft and called it a stabilization project. He's in the dark, Colleen. He's been in the dark for 30 years. She stayed with him that night, the two of them sitting on the porch as the moon rose over the valley. She searched his rusted toolbox and found the old mining maps, the ones that showed the illegal shafts, the ones the company had tried to erase from the official records. The Hargrove property sat directly above the site of the explosion. The land sale Martha was pushing for on Monday wasn't just a business deal. It was a final burial. Once the heavy machinery moved in, the evidence would be crushed under 1,000,000 tons of rock. She had 48 hours. Monday morning arrived with the cold finality of an execution. Colleen walked into the school, her head held high, only to be met by the principal at the door. He handed her a manila envelope, his eyes avoiding hers. "Administrative leave, Colleen. Effective immediately. The board, they had concerns about your conduct." "Martha," Colleen said. "It wasn't a question. I can't help you. Just go home." She walked back to her car and found all 4 tires slashed to the rims. A note was pinned to the windshield with a sheriff's deputy's badge number scrawled on the back. "Stay off the streets." She was isolated, stripped of her job, her mobility, her reputation. But she wasn't alone. Silas was waiting for her in the shadows of the parking lot, his leather jacket zipped tight against the rain. "My uncle works for the company," he said, his voice low. "The sale is at noon on Monday. They're bringing in the dozers at 1. If you're gonna move, you gotta move now." "I need the deeds, Silas. The original ones from '94. They're in the county archives." "The sheriff's got the front blocked. But there's a way in through the school basement, the old coal tunnels. They connect to the municipal building. They moved through the dark, flooded tunnels like rats, the smell of stagnant water and mold filling their lungs." Colleen followed Silas's lead, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The physical difficulty of the trek was a penance. Every time she slipped in the muck, every time a rusted pipe scraped her arm, she thought of Jacob in the dark. They reached the archives, a windowless room filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves. They worked frantically, pulling files, searching for the paper trail that linked the mining company to the Hargrove land. "Here," Silas whispered, holding up a ledger. "Look at the date. It was a donation. $2 million, processed the day Jacob disappeared. It wasn't a gift. It was a payoff. A flashlight beam cut through the room, hitting them like a physical blow. Sheriff Carter stood in the doorway, his gun drawn. "I told you to stay home, Colleen," he said. His voice was tired, the voice of a man who had been lying for so long he couldn't remember the truth. "You're done, Daniel. We have the ledger. We have the maps. You have nothing but a trespassing charge and a student who's about to go to juvie." He lunged for the ledger. Colleen swung a heavy archival box, the weight of 100 years of history hitting him in the face. Silas tackled his legs, and they went down in a heap of paper and dust. It was a brutal, desperate fight in the narrow stacks. Colleen grabbed a heavy metal bookend and struck Carter across the temple. He slumped, dazed. "The vault!" she yelled to Silas. They dragged the sheriff into the reinforced evidence room and slammed the door, throwing the heavy iron bolt. He roared and hammered against the steel, but they were already gone, sprinting back through the tunnels with the documents tucked under Colleen's arm. She went to a safe house, a small apartment Silas knew, and began to read the final set of papers. She found her mother's signature on the tuition checks. She found the bank statements. She saw the cost of her own life laid out in neat, black ink. She collapsed on the floor, the weight of the betrayal finally breaking her. She had been saved by the very thing that had killed her brother. But the grief didn't stop her. It sharpened her. Sunday dinner at the Hargrove house was a tradition of silence and starch. Aunt Martha sat at the head of the table, the mining company representative beside her. The contract laid out on the lace tablecloth like a holy relic. The sheriff was there, a bandage on his head, his eyes burning with a quiet, lethal rage. Colleen walked in without knocking. She didn't look like a teacher. She looked like a storm. Her father followed her, his steps steady for the first time in years. "What is this?" Martha demanded, standing up. "You're not welcome here." Colleen didn't say a word. She placed the old boombox in the center of the table, right on top of the contract. She pressed play. Eleanor's voice filled the room. The whispers, the terror, and then the roar of the explosion. The mining representative froze, his hand hovering over his pen. "This is the sound of the North Ridge site," Colleen said. Her voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the chaos on the tape. "This is the sound of the crime you've been hiding for 30 years. I have the ledger, I have the maps, and I have a witness." She looked at her father. Thomas stood tall, his gaze fixed on Martha. "I'm done lying, Martha. He's under the ridge, and we're going to bring him home." Martha tried to snatch the tape, her face a mask of primal fury. "You're destroying us. You're destroying everything we built. We built it on a grave," Colleen screamed. The sheriff moved to arrest her, his hand reaching for his cuffs, but Thomas stepped between them. He didn't use a gun. He just used his presence, the weight of a man who had finally decided to be a father. "Touch her," Thomas said, "and I'll tell them about the blood you scrubbed off your cruiser that night, Daniel." The mining representative stood up, his face pale. "This deal is dead. We don't touch sites with active criminal investigations. My company is out." He fled the room, leaving the contract fluttering on the floor. Martha sank into her chair, her pearls rattling against her chest. She was a woman who had lost her grip on the world, her power evaporating like mist in the sun. The resolution was quiet. The dozers didn't come. The land wasn't sold. The investigation would take years, and the town would likely die anyway. But it would die with its eyes open. Colleen sat on the front porch with her father. The rain had stopped, leaving the air smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. They shared a glass of water, the cool liquid, a small, necessary mercy. She took out the cassette tape and turned it over. She pressed record. My name is Colleen Hargrove, she whispered. And this is the truth about my brother, Jacob. The cycle was broken. The silence was over. And for the first time in 30 years, Colleen could finally breathe.